So now in our story here of the US, so we actually finally have a United States here by the time we get to chapter 7. And this is where part 2 in the textbook starts. And we really do have 4 time periods that we're dealing with here in chapter 7. I think, get them, yeah, right here. So we have 4 time periods that we're dealing with here. First, we're not a country yet in the beginning here. So in the Revolutionary War phase, 1775 to 1883, we're fighting this war. Then, once we win the war, well, 1775, you've got minor skirmishes leading up to the Declaration of Independence. And then the Declaration of Independence gets sent to England, and then you've got to build up relations with France, which also was unhappy with England. And with France's help, we're able to defeat the British, which then gets us the second phase, which would be the peace and independence phase that comes after the war. Then the French have the Napoleonic Wars between 1793 and 1815. This would be when those of like Washington and Jefferson were having the US adopt policies of neutrality. And that worked out incredibly well for the United States in these early years when they really needed the money. This helped them out a lot because basically England and France were just committed to fighting each other. And it's two of among the most um, strongest countries in the world at the time. So the fact that they were distracted by fighting this war with each other allowed the United States to fill that void. I guess as the AI text says, and it allowed the United States to thrive in those early years. And then again, we buy the Louisiana Purchase in 1803 and whatnot. But then things become a little bit more complex with the War of 1812, and that would be kind of our 4th period in this early history of the United States. Okay, so let's start with that. The big thing we need to talk about would be how does the economy change during the Revolutionary War itself? And what we see is that it dramatically alters how things exist in terms of the export relationships and import relationships. The Revolutionary War starts in 1775, April of 75. It lasts for 6 years, so that takes us out to essentially 1781, 1782. And then with that, you then have to start working on a constitution and whatnot. We don't get the constitution until, if my memory serves me right, not until with the first 10 amendments. I don't think we get that until 1789. So yeah, I mean, the Revolutionary War itself, despite what the movies would tell us, like The Patriot and whatnot, most um, most people didn't really want this Revolutionary War. I'm not sure here if it's going to tell us. Yeah, it's going to tell us this in the slide here. So let's just jump to this slide here. Most people did not want the Revolutionary War. And the big reason why they would not want that war was because, as you can see here in this slide, slide 5, is that in some sense, they knew that it was going to dramatically change how the economy existed. And it did. it changed the trade routes, it just changed the economic relationships significantly. And again, the southern colonies were the ones that would have been most opposed to it. But in some sense, like taking your medicine, in the long run, it was a good thing. Because again, mercantilism was not going to help the economy grow. And so we need to build now this kind of post-mercantilist, post-England economy. And that would be bigger, right? The revolutionary part of the Revolutionary War, for me, the economist, the revolution isn't about us transitioning from a monarchy controlled to a democracy. Although I'm sure if this were a political science class, that would be the case. No, instead, the revolutionary aspect is changing from a mercantilist-based economy to a capitalist-based economy. And that is kind of what we're seeing here after the Revolutionary War ends. Yeah. That would mean then that my disagreement with the, I'm not sure if I want to say my disagreement with the textbook, because I don't think the textbook emphasizes it as much as the AI slide does. The AI slide throws number one in there, the fight for freedom. I don't deny that that's the case, but I don't know. I'm saying this as a person who's 48 years of age. I don't know if it's I've become more jaded over time, but certainly if someone came into here, into my office and said, I'd like to fight for freedom, generally I'd be thinking, well, that's a pretty big luxury that you seem to be able to afford. I don't think I'd get too worked up about fighting for freedom as much as I would about economic survival. What we also do see, though, about this Revolutionary War is that it wasn't very popular. Most colonists either didn't care at all or were loyal to Britain. Only a third were really passionate about breaking the ties with England. And I'm not sure of that third that really wanted this Revolutionary War. Yeah, you're going to get people like, John Adams and Ben Franklin and even Thomas Jefferson who care about these rights issues, right? The number one thing, self-governance, freedom from oppressive taxation. Yeah, those philosophers probably care a great deal about that kind of stuff. But again, for the business people, especially in the South, big deal, right? Let's just, let's keep economic prosperity going here. No, once we're in the war, once we're in the Revolutionary War, um, we're not going to win without the French. And we need the French and especially their naval power in order to beat the British, who at the time were the strongest naval power in the world. And why is the Navy so important? Because it's the oceans that are being used for all the trade, right? So this is why we then also need this is also why we need basically pirates to be able to keep commerce going, at least illicitly, between the United States and the old world. Basically, we need to support the black market. But despite this black market existing, and the British, with their supreme naval forces, creating these blockades and other colonial restrictions, the net result of that was that we didn't have an economy in the United States to be able to fight this war well. There were shortages in everything, not only in the military things, but also just the everyday living things. And so not only are you getting then shortages, but also you've got this really big issue of how do you pay for it? that's incredibly difficult. Individual states um, can do some taxation. We don't certainly have a central government or a federal government that can do any taxation. So the individual states are taking on the debt burden of paying for this war. And again, the colonies are just starting to learn how to print currency and whatnot, and they're not controlling it very well. So you've got rapid inflation from the fact of just printing so much of these fiat currencies. Now, the war did help in one sense. The war did encourage the production of manufactured goods and even of some finished goods, only because they couldn't get them anymore from the old world. So it encouraged changes in the economy that should have been started earlier. And we're kind of setting the stage for lesser dependence on the old world. But still, that's a pretty big upheaval. And it's going to make a rather unpopular war even less popular. And so that's what we see here, right? Is that the Continental Congress, which is really, I don't know why this AI picture shows up. None of these look like founding fathers to me. Anyway, the Continental Congress, as I already said, we didn't have a central government that was going to be doing any taxation. So the individual states would have to be the ones to do it. The states themselves already kind of knew that people didn't want this revolutionary war. So they weren't going to be able to, they had the power to tax, but they really couldn't do that much taxing, which meant that the biggest way they were going to pay for things would be by printing more currency, which again is causing the problem of this inflation. So financing the revolution, incredibly difficult. Incredibly difficult. And that's what we see right here, right? That the between 1775 and 1781, you've got, I don't know here, did the slides capture it? They didn't. Let's put it right. No, they don't even have it here. No. Okay, so what are we seeing here? That between 1775 and 1781, which are primarily the war years here, what we're seeing here is the printing of $200 million in continental money. So that would be, oh, and then also we get $150 million in central government certificates for the quartermaster and commissary, and then another $200 million in paper money issued by the states. So you've got 200 million federal money, 200 million state money, 150 million federal, basically, certificates. So you've got $550 million of basically fake printed money. And then you've also got the states and the Congress taking on debt, and they can't even make the interest payments on those things. Because again, the central government didn't even have the power to tax anything. So, yeah, they're basically just printing cash. And that's what we see here with this rapid depreciation. The printing basically over $500 million in worthless currency, which I guess gives us here in number 9 that quote of not worth a continental. Over $500 million for a newly established country that can't even make interest payments on the debt. No wonder most people, right? If we could have made bets on is the United States going to win, we would say it's not likely, primarily because they can't even pay to fight this war. I mean, the odds would have been in England's favor, which is again why there's such a surprise that England ended up losing because the economic situation in the United States was quite precarious. Yeah. So you don't get the Constitution again until 1789, after the war is won. And again, you don't get the Bill of Rights until 1791, which then you get the Washington. You don't get Washington as president until the, if my memory serves me correctly here, the Washington administration I don't think starts until 1792. I could be wrong. 1789. So yeah, we would get it right after the Constitution goes into effect. Sorry, so it wasn't 1792. Yeah, so 1789. He gets inaugurated in New York City. Basically, where we today would see Wall Street and the stock market would be essentially where Washington took the oath of office using the Bible from the Freemasons. In March, because that used to be when up until didn't really see a January inauguration. I don't think until the Truman administration. I don't think so. We don't really see that until the mid 1950s. March used to be when inauguration occurred. Anyway, the precursor to the Constitution is our Articles of Confederation. Articles of Confederation is what the central government is after the Declaration of Independence is passed. So we go from Declaration of Independence, which basically says we're not going to be part of England, or we don't want to be part of England. Then we start to form the vestiges of a new country with the Articles of Confederation in 1775. Then after we win the Revolutionary War, we don't start working on we get the Constitution finally drafted by 1787 and then passed by 1789, which is then when Washington takes office in 1789, where the Constitution basically reflects a revision of the Articles of Confederation. What do we care about in this course? Well, we care about the economics of it a bit more. And the most important thing that the Constitution is going to do is it's going to heavily revise the ability of the central government to be able to tax. And that the other thing that the Constitution does is it takes on all of the debts that the states incurred to be able to fight the war. Who fought for that? That'd be Hamilton, right? Who again becomes our first U.S. Treasury Secretary. Because for Hamilton, this was important because Hamilton saw it as critically important that we needed to establish credit for this new country, especially with the Dutch, which would have been among the bankers basically for the entire world. And you can't do that, right? You can't build a credit rating and a credit score unless you take on debt and successfully pay off those debts, which we weren't doing during the Revolutionary War, right? We tried to ask the Dutch for money. We tried to borrow from them during the Revolutionary War, and they wouldn't give us any money because we weren't even making interest payments. I mean, they wanted the Dutch wanted England to not win the war, right? I mean, this would be their opening, at least, right, to having the United States as a market, which they couldn't do when England is running them as colonies. So it's not like the Dutch didn't care. They just didn't want to lend us money that they didn't think that we'd pay off. So the Constitution is giving the central government the, let's see here if we get the, that's not what Hamilton looks like. I don't even know who that. Go AI. Look at this. How could this even be a picture? That's not Hamilton. There ain't 50 states, and it's not going to say at the top Alexander is missing an I there. He's missing an I in his name. What does that even mean? That doesn't even make any sense. That's a horribly AI generated map or picture. Yeah. The navigation X, we already talked about that. That's not part of chapter 7. So I'm going to skip that because this isn't the right slides. Also, again, we've already talked about this. It doesn't appear in this chapter. Thanks, AI. Also, again, this is somewhat important. Let me talk about, these two slides, and then we'll do slide 17 here. As I mentioned a little bit already, what the Revolutionary War gives us is the reestablishment, the reconfiguration of trade relationships. And three of those relationships that we get would be, first, that we don't have to primarily ship things to England. Instead, we can start to send things more to France, to the Dutch, and to Sweden. Second, we can trade a bit more with the Greeks and try to, the Greeks being strong shippers, gives us a little bit more access to other Northern European countries. And as well, even though we got to take it either all the way around, well, primarily we got to take things all the way around South America, but we're also going to start to build trade relationships with China. And the Chinese end up really wanting our goods as well. Okay. And that's kind of what we see here. Not only are we becoming better at producing some manufactured goods, the biggest thing that we're seeing is a reconfiguration in who our trading partners are and what's being traded amongst them. So we do see a dramatic increase in the amount of exports, where the exports are tripling and the imports are only doubling, which again would mean that the trade deficit does decline in the early years of the United States, primarily helped by the fact that you've got a resumption of rivalries between the British and the French. So again, I was kind of already going into this here, but again, we get the Constitution that's basically a revision of the Articles of Confederation, and it's we get the draft of the Constitution by 1787. It finally becomes ratified in March of 1789. What we see in the Constitution is, again, the building of a federal system with the three branches, the executive, legislative, and judicial branches, each checking each other, right, getting us our balance of power. We get the Bill of Rights that are passed finally by 1791, the Bill of Rights being the first 10 amendments. And you get this establishment of a central government, but the bulk of the power is designed to be within the states. Because, right, once we win the Revolutionary War, the point is not to just replace England as our master with a central government. Let's say, well, the first capital is New York City. We're not just going to replace London with New York City, right? We don't want a strong central government, at least in the beginning. That's the whole point of the Bill of Rights, and even in the structure of the Constitution, where it says that rights that are not explicitly stated to be part of the national government are reserved for the states. That's the spirit, at least, of the Constitution, or as our AI-generated picture would say, we the despli. Yeah, AI and logo ipsum. Okay, let me pause here for a few moments here. And so as we look a little bit further, because this will have an impact on the economy, in the transition from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution, the states were really worried, right? The states primarily, and most of the people, did not want a very strong national government. So again, that was why the focus was on here, number 4, having that Bill of Rights so that the liberties of individuals would be protected, certainly from the central government. But that also, again, that line that was so important of saying that if we don't give the power to the central government, the federal government, then that responsibility is assigned to the state. And we see that continue to this day, really, where states believe that they have the right to do the thing, and that the federal government has no right to do the thing that they're trying to do. I mean, in some sense, that's kind of the conversation about things like, for instance, education and other things. But again, that's the concern. And that would give us our first 2 parties here, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, where the Federalists were those who were in favor of a strong central government. That would be kind of like your Alexander Hamilton. And then opposition from the Anti-Federalists, those who were scared of the tyranny and the loss of the freedoms that came along with it. That would come from having tyranny coming from a central government that is too powerful. Again, we already talked about the polarity of this picture. Hamilton doesn't look like that. They're not using ballpoint pens. That would also be historically inaccurate. And Hamilton wouldn't have a map behind him with all the state lines. Unless this is like Back to the Future, or Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. He's gone into the future. Poor guy. Yeah, but Hamilton is important despite the fact that this picture has nothing to do with it. When we think about the economy, Hamilton, and not the guy that's in this picture, Hamilton is born in Haiti, I think. He's born in Haiti. Sorry, St. Kitts, but it was certainly in the West Indies. Born a poor person, and comes to the New World for, or comes to the United States basically to build for himself a richer identity, a new identity, one where you would have more money. That's how he looks. Obviously dies in a pretty famous way, as a duel with Aaron Burr, and he gets shot by Aaron Burr and dies. Way too early. Again, he was Secretary of the Treasury during the Washington administration. Yeah, and what? Yeah, died in 1804. So that would have been during the that would have been with Adams. Actually, I think Adams would have been president when he died. John Adams being probably the most of the founding fathers, among my favorite, and one of the most forgotten founding fathers as well. Um, did not like John Adams did not like Alexander Hamilton at all, and because again, John Adams, he would have been the kind of founding father that would have been like, you know, we fight this revolution so that we can be free, right? He's this kind of philosophical guy, and Alexander Hamilton was more monetary and economically speaking interested in things. But again, I don't think, and obviously a very strong Federalist, as I indicated earlier. Mm, you get this famous picture here of the shooting. They're pretty extent. I have never seen the play. Oh, here we go. Look at that. Burr is shot Alexander Hamilton. That this guy in the corner can be like this. Oh my God. It actually turned out that Alexander Hamilton, the story I read was that Alexander Hamilton was actually really scared about this duel, but he felt obligated to do it. Yeah, he dies in Weehawken, New Jersey. Anyway, why is Hamilton so important here? Because he is among the few in the newly established United States to realize that taking on all the debt of the states is important for building up credit, and that Hamilton is among the few to basically say that we need to have a central bank in the United States. And he even starts a bank himself, a bank that still exists to this day, Bank of New York Mellon. It started out as Bank of New York. Right. So think about that. We have a bank today in the United States that was created by this founding father. It's the oldest bank in the United States, Bank of New York Mellon. And why is it important today? Because it's actually being used quite a bit in the Bitcoin and the stable coins, actually. Not Bitcoin, but stable coins. But this is the person, Alexander Hamilton, that's responsible for starting to move us away from having a mercantilist based economy, having a capitalist economy. And the only way you can have a capitalist economy is if you have credit ratings. And that's what Hamilton's going to push for us here. And that's what we see right here. What you see as well, I actually don't think, is that the case? I don't think, Is that even true? Let me see first before I say it. Let me pause here for a second. Yeah, what I'm questioning here, and even the formal research is a little bit iffy on about it, is number two here. I'm not sure you could say that many states oppose the plan for the national government, the federal government, to take on all the debt. My understanding of it was that um, the contrary to this, that actually many states supported the plan of the federal government taking on debt. There wasn't a great deal of fear about the taxation because they weren't using an income tax structure at this point. They wouldn't use that until well, the Civil War. Let's start it out, and then you don't get an individual income tax until World War One. It's mainly that we get these taxes increasing with wars, but for the Revolutionary War, we was still relied on excise taxes. So I would disagree with number two, but let's just take that out here. So ignore number two. I don't think that that's entirely accurate. But for number one, so Hamilton, the Federalist, is pushing for the federal government to take on all the debts that the states had incurred during the Revolutionary War, of how to fight it. The South didn't want that to happen. And the reason why the South didn't want that to happen is that they were really scared that now that the Revolutionary War was won, that this central government would end up taking more control and power over the southern states that, to be honest, were more economically superior to the North, right? So why would they want to give up that? Why would they want to have power economically, but no power um, financially in terms of the debt? And given the amount of economic activity, they could have paid off the debt on their own. For Hamilton, though, and Jefferson, um, somewhat his Jefferson was somewhat his friend. Um, Hamilton and Jefferson. Hamilton had convinced Jefferson that having a credit rating was important and having a central bank was important. And yeah, why did I say that? No, by the time Hamilton got shot up, that would have been during the Jefferson administration. Yeah, I don't know why I said that it would have been during Adams. No, it would have been during Jefferson, the third president. Um, Sorry, you history buffs in this class. You were probably thinking Scheiding doesn't know history. Um, uh, Jefferson and Hamilton were somewhat close to each other, and Hamilton had convinced Jefferson of this need for the central government to take on all the debt. The South, the newly established Southern states, were against this. The only way they got this to happen was, remember, Jefferson is from the South. He's from Virginia. So they got a compromise, and the compromise was that they would put the new capital, the capital was in New York City. And so they moved the capital from New York. They agreed to move it south of the Potomac River, what we would currently call Washington, D.C., with uh, John Adams, the second president, being the first president to be in the newly constructed White House, which was a swamp. Not a great place. Washington, D.C. was like nothing. It's like the backwater because it literally was like swampy, dangerous, unhealthy backwater. But the South wanted the new central government to be located in the South, just barely. I mean, it's just south of the Potomac, which I guess was considered the northern South. I guess that's as best as we can get. And that's what we see right here. And Hamilton as well, he wants this establishment of the central bank. One thing I do want to that for whatever reason, the slides don't talk about, do they? No, they don't. What the slides don't talk about, which they should have, would be that, again, at this time, The Wealth of Nations is coming out. It's a bestseller. This is the book from Adam Smith, and this is also heavily influencing Hamilton's structuring of the economy. Now, here's what I want you to focus on from the textbook. Page 115. Right here. This is a really good summary of what's going on at this time, this last sentence on page 115. Let me read it to you. The United States is especially well tailored to Adam Smith's concept of an economic order, directed by self-interest that limited governmental rules and regulations, but ensured the domestic tranquility and freedom from foreign interference that only a strong central government could provide. That is how we're structuring the central government and the state government and the economy as a whole. All of that is happening in this first 10 years of the economy of the country. The relationships between the federal and the states and the building up of the economy from it. That's all happening in this first 10 years. And that's what we have summarized here for us on page 115. So again, we get a national bank, which is going to manage the money, issue the credit, pay off the loans, issue the currency, which is given as a right within the Constitution. And what we see is that Hamilton was right. Hamilton was right in the sense that, yeah, we pretty quickly got a line of credit from the Dutch by taking on all this debt, that we had established our credit rating, basically. The thing I was saying earlier was that, so we established a country, and I don't think, if I'm not mistaken, yeah, this is generated by AI. This is not in the textbook, but AI is not entirely wrong here. So how do we pay off this debt? Again, we don't have an income tax or anything like that. It's excise taxes, as I said. Well, one of these, so an excise tax is a tax on a specific good. And the one tax that we had was one on whiskey, which was problematic because only a few years after the country was started, still during the presidency of Washington, Western Pennsylvania was where farmers started to revolt against all of these taxes on the goods that they were producing with their surplus grains, called the Whiskey Rebellion. And basically, Washington sent troops to the frontier to Western Pennsylvania to put down that rebellion. And basically, within those first few years, basically, the central government basically said, you know what, we've got the defense, we've got the military, we're going to enforce laws and assert ourselves. And that is essentially what they did during this Whiskey Rebellion. This is not in the textbook chapter, but it is somewhat relevant to the story that we're telling here, because this Whiskey Rebellion would represent the central government taking a stand on paying off this debt that they now had taken on. The Napoleonic Wars, on the other hand, are talked about a bit here. Again, this helps the U.S. economy in multiple ways. The one big way would be that, again, it reconfigures the markets again, and it helps the U.S. Trade with both England as well as France, while saying that they are neutral. And it just helps a trade surplus grow quite significantly. So again, we were helped in that first decade of our country uh, by the fact that others started fighting with each other. And again, you see this as well with the shipping industry, where things are increasing a great deal as well. The Let me pause here for a second. I was just kind of looking at these last slides here, and um, again, you get the War of 1812, which again was important in the sense that it was the fourth part of this, right? Because we've gone through the Revolutionary War, we've gone through the peace and independence, and then we were just talking about the Napoleonic Wars. The War of 1812 was important because, again, it was now another example early in this American history where we're reconfiguring again the lines of trade and whatnot. But this is also where we kind of finally, for the last time, push England off of us and say, no, dude, leave us alone. They famously do burn down Washington, D.C. and the White House as much as they could. But again, it gives us the War of 1812 becomes another point at which we're disrupting trade. And we quite quickly have to fight again England, which we win again in that war. But no, so the slides are here and they're not inaccurate. I don't want you to focus on that though, because again, this is US economic history. Instead, I want to show you three pictures from the reading. The first one being here. So if we look at, from the Shepard and Walton piece, what we see here is in terms of these eras, look at this. In terms of trade, going to Great Britain and Ireland, it's going from 58% of total exports to 31%. England is losing its status as our primary trading partner. Who's gaining it? Everybody else. Look at this. We've got a broadening of all of our trading partners from the time from when we had the Navigation Acts to now no longer are the Navigation Acts relevant, right? Now everyone can be our trading partners because we are our own country. Helps us because during the Napoleonic Wars and during the War of 1812, we've got others to rely on for our trading as opposed to here. So again, this graph right here highlights for us how revolutionary the Revolutionary War was. This right here encapsulates that dramatic expansion in our trading partners. Okay, picture number two. Right on the, where is it all going to? Again, middle, north, south colonies, all different. And so when we look at that, right, what we're seeing is that for the most part, right, it was the case that the South did suffer from the Revolutionary War, right? Because now they've got exports at least that are getting a little bit smaller because they don't have that good symbiotic relationship with England anymore. Who gained? The northern colonies and the middle colonies. So basically, by fighting the Revolutionary War, the northern and the middle colonies were able to gain somewhat of an economic advantage over the South. Oh, dude, look at this picture. Sorry, but you can see this here on page 119. Again, this is important because now these are not colonies anymore. Now these are becoming states when we get out to over here. And we're starting the long journey now of the South becoming more economically depressed compared to the northern and the middle states. This picture is inaccurate. How do I know that it's inaccurate? Well, a lot of reasons. I'm guessing this is an AI image of Benjamin Franklin, who probably would not be eating with someone who is African American. I'm sure there were social mores that would have been opposed to that. But the bigger reason why, well, there's two things that are inaccurate about this picture. One, there wouldn't be light bulbs, which appear right here. The other thing that wouldn't be accurate would be the Ferris wheel doesn't get invented until the Chicago World's Fair in like 1892. And yet it's appearing in this picture when Ben Franklin would have been dead. I think that's accurate. Sorry, 18, yeah, 18, I said 1892, it was 1893, Chicago World's Fair. Yeah. Again, don't think you're not going to get caught if you use AI. Well, at least for pictures, geez. These things are horrible. Let me go back to the other picture I want to show you though here. Look at this. This goes back to that trade deficit being transformed dramatically into a trade surplus. And you certainly see that the US benefited quite extensively from the Napoleonic Wars, right? Where we were able to establish new relationships and export a great deal. Only hurt by the fact that we entered the War of 1812. And that really does hurt our ability to export a great deal of goods. And again, you get this reconfiguration of the trading relationships. Okay, let's go to here just to make sure. Yeah, somewhat okay of a summary. It's just missing a few key points about those three pictures, those three graphs I just showed you. In some sense, this is the value of, for those of you who are actually listening to my lectures, this is the value of listening to my lecture. If you were just to look at the slides to be able to gain all the information about this class, you're not getting everything you need from the slides. I mean, in fact, you're finding several errors with the slides themselves. I think they're somewhat useful because they're helping me structure my conversation during these lectures. And if anything, it's a pretty cool contest and keeps us pretty engaged to identify the errors in these AI generated slides.